If you have these pages, we're going to start this essay called Minchas HaOmer VeHaSefira, which appears on page 209. And this essay in Hegyonei Halacha addresses the question of the relationship between Sefirat HaOmer and the Carbon HaOmer, which really, in a sense, projects us from Sefira into the Beis HaMikdash itself. And the mitzvah of the Omer took place in the Beis HaMikdash on the 16th of Nisan. And after we culminate the counting of 49 days, on the 50th day, which is Chag HaShavuos, we are brought back into the Beis HaMikdash, in this case, for the bringing of Shtei Alechem. So we have, in a sense, a sandwich here that opens up, we could call it bookends maybe, that opens up with the Omer that's brought in the Beis HaMikdash and closes with the Shtei Alechem that's brought in the Mikdash, and the bridge that connects those two karbanos is the sphere itself. So the goal for today is to try to understand whether there is a relationship between the Omer and the Sefira. Obviously, we call it Sefirat HaOmer, but that could be because we count from the day on which the Omer is brought, Mimachos HaShabbos. But is there perhaps a more direct connection, sort of a binding together of the Sefira and the Omer? And what we're going to try to do is, we're going to try to analyze the Rishonim and see where they fit into place and how they address this very fundamental question. So if you're looking on page 209, you have that, 209? I don't see that you have it, but if you have it, then you'll see that in Parshas Emor, the Torah seems to connect the counting of the Omer with the Beis HaMikdash. Usfartem lachem mibachas HaShabbos miyom aviachem es ofra tnufa. The Omer tnufa obviously is brought in the Beis HaMikdash. Sheva Shabbosos tmimos tiyena ad mibachas HaShabbos hashvius tisperu chamishim yom v'kravtem mincha chadosh al Hashem. So that the Sefira culminates on day number 50 in the Beis HaMikdash with the Shtei Alechem that's brought on Chag HaShavuos. So we have in one pasuk, number one, Sefirat HaOmer, Usfartem Lachem. Number two, we have Havas HaOmer, Miyom Aviachem es HaOmer. And number three, we have the Shtei Alechem, V'kravtem Mincha Chadosh al Hashem. So this is all pushed together, almost collapsed into one command that seems to interlock the Sefira with the Omer on the one end at the kickoff point and the Shtei Alechem at the end zone. Sefira connecting all this, so we're counting from the beginning of Mikdash to the end of Mikdash in this period of 7 weeks. Now, if we interpret it that bringing the Omer and the Sefira are two independent mitzvos, and when I say independent means Einon Tluyos Zu B'Zu, which means the Torah is just telling you when is the proper time for Sefira, and that is on the day of bringing the Omer. But it's not telling you that you're counting the Omer, meaning the carbon. We're not counting the carbon. We start out counting from the day in which the Omer is brought. So we have two independent mitzvahs, but we can interpret the pasuk much differently. And these really are not independent mitzvahs, but interdependent mitzvahs, meaning haba hatalia. And the Torah is commanding us to count the days from the Omer, not just because the Omer is the kickoff, it's the starting point of the Sefira, but because the essential mitzvah is to count the days from the Omer and going forward until we finally culminate with the Shtei Alechem, the Beis Hamikdash, on Chag HaShavuos. And if we take the latter interpretation, then today that we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, we don't have the Omer, nor do we have the Shtei Alechem, then the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer just falls by the wayside. It's meaningless. Because in our second interpretation, the Torah wants you to count from the Omer to the Shtei Alechem. If there's no Omer, no Shtei Alechem, there's no Mikdash, then the counting is completely devoid of any sort of a kiyum. Masha Enkein, in conscious that we go with the first definition that interprets Sefira as being kicked off by the Omer, but that's just a way of identifying the day in which we have to begin the Sefira. But it's not that the Sefira is any way connected to the mitzvah of the Omer. Adarab, on the contrary, the mitzvah Sefira is independent of the mitzvah of the Omer. We're going to count them as two separate mitzvahs in Taryag. And if the Sefira is independent of the Omer, then even if we have no Omer, because after the Churban Habayis we have no Karbanos, certainly not the Omer, but nevertheless the mitzvah of Sefirat Omer stands on its own, despite the fact that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we don't have a Karban Omer. So what is it? How do we understand these psukim? And this is probably the most fundamental question or issue that you can discuss and address in Sefirat HaOmer. What is the status of Sefirat HaOmer today, post-Churban? If we say that Sefira depends upon the Mikdash and the mitzvahs of Omer and Shtei Alechem, then today there's no mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer. It's gone by the wayside. It went down with the Churban. If, on the other hand, you're saying that the identification of the day of Havas HaOmer is just a way of identifying the day in which we start the Sefira, but the Sefira is a separate mitzvah to be counted independently in Taryag, then even Bisman Hazeh, when we don't have the Mikdash, we still should have a mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer. Now, having said that as an introduction, we now learn a sugya in Menachas Taf Samach Vav, which is on the bottom paragraph on your page 209. And the Gemara records a machlokas amoraim about how we count the Omer. One man, the Omer says we have to count both days and weeks, and the other man, the Omer says no, it's enough to count days. We don't have to count weeks. So the Gemara tells us that according to Abaye and Tana Debei Rav Ashi, so for our purposes, we'll call it Abaye and Rav Ashi, just to make life a little easier. According to Abaye and Rav Ashi, we count both days and weeks. This is what we're familiar with today. So today is 25 days in the Omer, which is 3 weeks and 4 days. You know what I'm saying? You count both the days and the weeks. Again, you have another issue about counting weeks, whether it's every week and we jump from 1 week to the next, or even within the days, we should be counting the weeks as well. But be that as it may, according to both Abaye and Rav Ashi, we count both days and weeks. And presumably, the reason why we do so is because in Parshas Emor, as we mentioned earlier, the Torah says, Sheva Shabbosos, Tmimos Tiyenim V'Safarta, Fartem. And then it says, Tisbu Chamishim Yom. So we have both Sheva Shabbosos, which means 7 sets of 7 days, and we have the Sefira of the days. And therefore, we're going to count both days and weeks. And as I said before, that should not surprise us. We're doing exactly what it says in the Pasuk. However, the Gemara quotes the dissenting view of HaOmer. And this you'll see 2 lines before the end of the page. HaOmer would count the days and not the weeks. So today is the 25th day of the Omer, period. That's it. No need to go into 3 weeks and how many days and all that. We just count the days. This is the 25th day of the Omer. So the Gemara first raises the question, the obvious question on HaOmer. why didn't you count weeks? Why don't you do exactly what it says in the Torah? I mean, according to Abaye and Rav Ashi, it says to count not only days, but also weeks. So we have to count weeks. Why, HaOmer, do you drop the weeks and you only count the days? And the Gemara gives a 3-word answer, of which 2 words are significant. Omar. I guess Omar means Omar HaOmer. Zecher LeMikdash. To remember the Beis HaMikdash. Which reminds us of the Gemara in Sukkah. The Gemara says that since the Churban, we have to do things to remind ourselves of the Mikdash, Mishum Zecher LeMikdash. And as the Navi says, Tzion Doresh Ein Lo, we have to be Doresh Tzion, and that's by setting up a Zecher LeMikdash. And here, we're going to set up a Zecher LeMikdash and count the days of the Omer. That's the opinion of HaOmer. Now, on the one hand, HaOmer is saying that we downgrade the level of this mitzvah from a bona fide mitzvah as the Torah describes it, and it's a mitzvah d'oraisa. Now we're after the Churban. We cannot fulfill this mitzvah. We can only do a Zecher LeMikdash. And presumably, if we're only doing a Zecher LeMikdash in the counting, we can get away with just counting days. The whole thing, the whole institution, the whole enterprise of Sefirat HaOmer nowadays, the Rabbanan, Mishum Zecher LeMikdash, then it's enough. It's absolutely sufficient that you count the days. That'll give you that jolt of a memory to remember the Beis HaMikdash. So what then lies at the heart of this machlokas between Abaye and Rav Ashi on one side of the scales, who advocate counting both days and weeks, and HaOmer on the other side of the scale, who advocates counting days without weeks? And on this question about what lies at the heart, at the guts of the machlokas here, about whether we count weeks as well as days, we have a machlokas between Rashi and the Rambam. Says Rashi, everybody agrees that after the Churban Abayis, there's no mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer. Everybody agrees. And it was universally and without any dissenting view that Sefirat HaOmer in our times, after the Churban, is nothing more than Zecher LeMikdash. But the question is, how do we fulfill a Zecher LeMikdash? One interpretation, one definition is that we have to make believe as if the Mikdash stood now, and we have to duplicate exactly the way the mitzvah was fulfilled at the time of the Mikdash. And another way, the other opinion is, no, we don't have to duplicate exactly the way it was done in the Mikdash. We need just a zecher, meaning something to remind us of the Mikdash. So whereas Abaye and Rav Ashi are of the opinion that Zecher LeMikdash requires us to replicate the mitzvah as it was given by the Torah when the Mikdash stood, hence Sefirat HaOmer requires the counting of both days and weeks. HaOmer, on the other hand, holds no. We don't have to duplicate. The Zecher means we have to do something that'll jolt our memory and will remind us of the Beis HaMikdash. So the bottom line is that according to Rashi, Kuli Alma Lo Pligi, no one questions the premise that Sefirat HaOmer Bizman Hazeh is the Rabban. Zeichel Hamikdash. The Rambam has a different approach. The Rambam in the 7th parak of Hilchos Tmidim Musafim claims that a Meimar may hold that Sefirat Bizman Hazeh is only a Zeichel Hamikdash. But the balance of the Amoraim, represented here by Abai and Rav Ashi, they hold that Sefirat HaOmer, even in our times, after the Churban Abayis, is D'oraisa. So that when a Meimer was Mekil and required nothing more than counting the days of the Omer, that reflects his shita that Sefirat HaOmer is the Rabbanan. But in truth, the dissenting view of Abaye and Rav Ashi and many, many other Tanoim, apparently, is that Sefirat HaOmer today is D'oraisa. Which means that according to the Rambam Shita, what the Gemara is really debating here as a machlokas between Rav Ashi and Abai on the one hand and a Meir on the other is exactly the question that we raised earlier. What is the Sefirat HaOmer? Is it counting from one event that took place in the Mikdash and ending to another event that took place in the Mikdash? Or is it a separate independent mitzvah of counting the days of the Omer? If there's a separate independent mitzvah of counting the days of the Omer, it should apply even Bizman Hazeh. By contrast, if the mitzvah Sefira is to bridge between the Omer and the Shtei Alechem, we're counting the karbanos of the Omer as they were brought in the Mikdash, then Bizman Hazeh Sefirat HaOmer is the Rabbanan. And according to the Rambam, once you admit that Sefirat HaOmer today is only the Rabbanan, and it's Zeichel Hamikdash, then you can get away with the barest minimum. And we're going to be lenient, and we're going to ask you to count days, but we're going to drop the ball on weeks. But once again, just to summarize, whereas Rashi on the one hand understands the machlokas in the Gemara about counting weeks, revolves around how far does Zeichel Hamikdash go? What are the parameters of Zeichel Hamikdash? But the Rambam understands that the issue here about counting weeks depends upon whether Sefirat HaOmer Bizman Hazeh is D'oraisa or D'Rabbanan. And as we said before, just to summarize, whether it's D'oraisa or D'Rabbanan depends upon how you define the essence of the mitzvah of Sefira. Is it the karban, or is it a separate independent mitzvah of counting the days of Sefira? Now, all that I presented to you here so far is on page 210. On the bottom of page 210, and it's noted in a long footnote number 4, he sharpens up the definition of the machlokas, the two shitas of a Meimer on the one hand, who counts only days, Abaye and Rav Ashi on the other hand, who count days and weeks, based on the Brisker Rav. The Brisker Rav says that according to Rashi, everybody agrees it's Zeichel Hamikdash, but there are two ways of understanding Zeichel Hamikdash. The Rabbanan made a takana to count the Omer even after the Churban Abayis as a Zeichel Hamikdash. What did they have in mind? Do we have to remember the Sefira, or do we have to remember the Mikdash? So the Rabbanan made this takana, and the question is how to define the takana. HaOmer sover shasfira bizman hazeh takanta miyuchedes shel chachamim lasos zeichel lemikdash v'day bekach b'sfiras yomim bilvad lizkar es churban beis mikdashenu. We need just a catalyst to remind ourselves of the Mikdash and its destruction. And for that purpose, all we need is counting days. Abaye and Rav Ashi, on the other hand, they're of the opinion that the Sefira in our time is Zecher L'Sfiras Mikdash. Not just to, it's not enough when the Rabbanan made this takana to remember the Mikdash. They want you to remember the Sefira that took place in the Mikdash. So Abaye and Rav Ashi, you'll see this on the bottom of page 210, they hold that the Zeichel HaMikdash that we're talking about, that was established as a takana, requires you to kaviyachol stand in the Beis HaMikdash and count the Omer exactly the way they counted it in the Beis HaMikdash. Is Memela says the Brisker Rav, according to that sheet that we count both days and weeks, the Zeichel HaMikdash is Zeichel L'Sfira Sheb'Mikdash. Whatever mitzvah took place in the Mikdash gets its own Zeichel L'Churban. And the Zeichel L'Churban for the mitzvah of counting the Omer is to count both days and weeks. And if we, Bizman Hazeh, are going to count Shemitah, we're going to count Sefira the way they counted in the Mikdash. So it's a Zecher, not just to remind yourself of the Mikdash, but to duplicate the Sefira of the Mikdash. So it's Zecher L'Sfira Sheba Mikdash, which requires that you duplicate the Sefira of the Mikdash, hence count both days and weeks. Masha Ein Kain, according to HaOmer, we're not required to remember the Sefira. We're required to remember the Mikdash and its destruction. For that, counting days is sufficient. Now, it's going to be interesting to figure out why, according to HaOmer, in the context of Zeichel HaMikdash, we do this half-baked job. You know, it's enough to count the days. I mean, why not count the weeks? Why the days? Hopefully, we'll try to, resolve that issue. That's on page 211. The Rambam says that we paskin like the Rabbim, like the majority ruling, which is that of Abaye and Rav Ashi. And according to the Rambam, the reason why they require both Yomim and Shvuos is because Sfiras HaOmer Bizman Hazeh is Doraisa. And it's not Zeichel HaMikdash. The Gemara only mentions Zeichel HaMikdash to explain HaOmer. But the majority opinion holds that Sfiras HaOmer is not a Zeichel HaMikdash. It's a Doraisa halacha that applies today no less than it applied thousands of years ago, because the Omer is only the kickoff to tell me when I start counting, but the counting is an independent mitzvah unto itself. Now, on the bottom of page 211, he gets back to HaOmer. And HaOmer Zeichel HaMikdash, we said, was a little bit strange. We're reminding ourselves of the Mikdash simply by counting the days of the Omer. Plus epis. Why the days of the Omer? Why not the weeks of the Omer?
Sorry, Rav, can you just clarify? I'm sorry, so you're saying that there's a Zeicher to Sfiras HaOmer, and then there's a mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer.
Well, I would say it like this: there's a zecher of Sefirat HaOmer, and then there's a mitzvah to remember the fact that we once had a mikdash and it's destroyed.
So, but again, the zecher of the Sefirat HaOmer would say that it's still a D'Rabbanan, or it's saying that it's a D'Oraisa.
Correct. I'm saying, according to Rashi, everybody agrees it's D'Rabbanan. The question is, what is the D'Rabbanan? How do you define it? Zeichel is Sfira or Zeichel is Mikdash. If it's Zeichel is Sfira, then I have to duplicate the Sfira as it existed on a D'Oraisa level.
So, but if it's okay,
but if it's only Zeichel and Mikdash, then I could have shortcuts. What's going to remind me of the Mikdash? And for that, I can reduce it to recounting the days. And that's HaOmer. Again, why HaOmer chooses days as opposed to weeks, that we'll have to see at the bottom of page 211.
So we're all still saying that it's not a D'Oraisa, definitely not.
According to Rashi, Kuli Alma Lo Pligi, that Sefirat HaOmer depends upon the Omer, and therefore Bizman Hazeh, we don't have the Omer, we don't have Sefirat. What we have is a Zeicher.
Okay.
The question is how to define the Zeicher. That's Machlokas HaMoroi. According to the Rambam, on the other hand, HaOmer is the minority opinion, and he holds that Sefirat Bizman Hazeh is the Rabbanon, Zeicher L'Mikdash. And we're going to paskin, we're going to embrace the sheet of Rov Amoroim, like, for example, Abaye and Rav Ashi, that Sefirat Bizman Hazeh is D'Oraisa. So whatever the Torah tells you, namely count days and weeks, that applies today, no less than it did thousands of years ago. That's how the Rambam understands Rav Ashi and Abaye. So counting days and weeks, according to the Rambam, is a mitzvah d'oraisa. In that little Hineni Muchan of Mezuman, I don't know if you ever recited before the Sfira, it says, Kemoshe Kosev HaTorah. That's correct according to the Rambam. Whereas according to Rashi, there's a misnomer here. You should cross it out. What do you mean Kemoshe Kosev HaTorah? What do you mean Hineni Muchan of Mezuman? I'm going to now embark upon a kiyum mitzvah Kemoshe Kosev HaTorah? What are you talking about? We don't have a Kemoshe Kosev HaTorah today because we don't have a Mikdash. The Rambam has the upper hand. And this could have tremendous implications about Suffolk. If you have a doubt whether you can be Yotze in this way or whether you did Yotze, you didn't know, you're going to have to be Machmer according to the Rambam, because Sefirat HaOmer Bizman Hazeh according to the Rambam is D'Oraisa. We're going to pass like Abaye and Rav Ashi. Whereas Rashi holds that there never was a question about Sefirat HaOmer Bizman Hazeh, whether it's D'Oraisa or D'Rabbanan. Clearly, according to everyone, it's only D'Rabbanan, and Sefirat depends upon Mikdash. And the way the Brisker Rav interprets the Machlokas now within the framework of Rashi is whether it's a Zeicher, which is D'Rabbanan, a Zeicher L'Mikdash, just remind yourself that we had a Mikdash and it was destroyed, or it's a Zeicher L'Sfira Sheb'Mikdash. If it's Zeichel Sfira Sheb'Mikdash, we have to duplicate the Sfira as it was. That's called Kol D'Tikkun D'Rabbanan Ke'ein D'Oraisa Tikkun. And therefore, we have to count both days and weeks. But that's only in the framework of a D'Rabbanan of Zeicher L'Sfira. Zeicher. Whenever you hear the word Zeicher, you know you're talking about a D'Rabbanan. Now, on the bottom of 211, going on to 212, we have a Chiddush of the Sfas Emes in his commentary on Menachos Samach Vav, specifically Dibra Maskal HaOmer, focusing on the sheet of HaOmer that today, Bizman Hazeh Zeichel L'Mikdash, we only count days and not weeks. So Sfas Emes embarks upon the following analysis. The mitzvah Sefirat HaOmer appears in the Torah twice. Once in Parshas Emor, and the second time in Parshas Re'eh. So Parshas Emor, you'll see in footnote number 9, and Parshas Re'eh in footnote number 10. And there's a fundamental difference between the two formulations of the Torah of the mitzvah of Sefirah. He says the following: if you take a careful look at Parshas Emor, the Sefira culminates with the words "Vehikravtem mincha chadasha l'Hashem." In Parshas Re'eh, on the other hand, the mitzvah of Sefira culminates with the Asisa Chag Shavuos L'Hashem Elokecha. Furthermore, in Emor, we count not only days, but not only weeks, but also days, whereas in Parshas Re'eh, we count exclusively weeks. Says the Sfas Emes, a pretty sensational chiddush. Counting days and counting weeks are two different mitzvahs, two independent mitzvahs. And they come from two different parshios in the Torah. The counting of weeks, which is high profile in Parshas Re'eh, is all about Chag HaShavuos, the festival of weeks. How many weeks? 7 weeks. And then we embark upon Chag HaShavuos. And this year is an interesting phenomenon. We have 2 days of Shavuos, so to speak. Even in Eretz Yisrael, in Chutz La'aretz, you have 3 days of Shavuos. I don't mean that literally, but you know what I mean. You have Shabbos and then 2 days of Shavuos. So counting weeks in Parshas Re'eh is the high profile of that mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer. And that's because the Sefira ends with Chag HaShavuos. Shavuos meaning weeks. And that's what the Torah says, V'yasiso Chag Shavuos L'Hashem Elokecha. So count the weeks, 7 weeks of 7 days each, and then you're ready for Chag HaShavuos. He says the following. I'm going to read it inside. It's a very subtle point. Sefirat HaShavuos is line 3 on page 212. Mitzad Chag HaShavuos hi ba'a. Sefirat HaYomim ba'a mitzad HaOmer v'shtei Alecha. Now we understand that maybe. Ein osim zeichel mitzvos, el mitzvah shenaga bebeis hamigdash. Vehi mishameshes achshav zeichel migdash. Hoil Sefirat Shavuos eina kshura b'migdash, shekain eina ba el etzar Chag HaShavuos lo osab la amneimar zeicher b'sefira b'zman hazeh. Aval Sefirat HaYomim shetalu HaOmer u'shtei Alechem, Sefira zu kshura b'migdash, u'lefichach osab ba amneimar zeicher. So what he's saying is that we can identify 2 different elements that are fundamentally different one from the other in the context of the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer. One element is totally in Migdash, and the other element is Chag HaShavuos. The element of Chag HaShavuos is formulated in Parshas Re'eh, and there the Torah drops the ball, completely ignores the mitzvah of counting days. There's only a mitzvah of counting weeks. In Parshas Emor, when the Torah gives you the overview of Sefirat HaOmer, here it introduces another element. In addition to counting the weeks in order to sanctify after 7 weeks Chag HaShavuos, we also count days in order to link and bridge between the Omer that was brought in the Mikdash on Tesvav, on the Tezayin, and the Shtei Lechem that was brought on Chag HaShavuos. So if you ask me which of these two elements belongs to Zeichel and Mikdash, says HaOmer, clearly the counting of days. The counting of weeks is a different mitzvah. That's a mitzvah that facilitates our sanctification, if you will, of the 50th day as Chag HaShavuos. That's independent of the Mikdash and does not deserve a Zeichel and Mikdash. I hope you can help me here with this Sfas Emes. I don't understand. On the one hand, he's saying, okay, Zeichel and Mikdash requires counting days because that's what appears in Parshas Emor. And that's the Parsha of the Omer and the Shtei Lechem. Counting weeks is not connected to the base of Mikdash and therefore doesn't deserve a Zeichel of Mikdash. The Zeichel of Mikdash must be concentrated exclusively on counting days because it's only in Parshas Emor where the Torah combines the two karbanos in the base of Mikdash, bridging them with the Sefirat. That's where the Torah requires counting days. And if that's a Mikdash mitzvah of counting days to connect one carbon with the other, then there's a mitzvah of Zeichel Mikdash after the Churban, and that is expressed and manifest in counting days. But what I don't understand here, what am I missing? Why doesn't HaOmer count the weeks? Or to say it even sharper, why isn't counting weeks a mitzvah d'oraisa b'zman hazeh? Insofar as we have a culmination of the weeks with after 7 weeks with Chag HaShavuos. That's independent of the Mikdash, stands on its own 2 feet, and that should apply even b'zman hazeh. We said that according to Rashi, Kuliyam lo pligi, there's no mitzvah d'oraisa b'zman hazeh. So I'm going to read it one more time. Maybe, sometimes I read it a second time, a third time. He says, "Whole v'sfiras shvuas ain't kshura b'mikdash." So why not count shvuas as an independent mitzvah, independent of the Beis Hamikdash? I don't see it. That piece of the puzzle I'm missing.
So you can't say that he would break it up? When HaOmer is talking, he's only talking about days, and he would say you would have to count d'oraisa. You'd have to count 7 times, count each week.
But that's not so, because it's only Abaye and Rav Ashi who require you to count days and weeks. HaOmer says only count the days. I mean, that's black and white. You can't change it.
HaOmer, but he's not even. It doesn't come into his. He's not even thinking about the weeks. He's acknowledging that you have to make a count. But the count is only 7 times. He's not talking about it. It's not in his parsha to discuss it at all. He's only saying when you're
No, wait
counting.
a second, Joe, I don't understand. Abaye and Rav Ashi said you have to count not only days, but weeks. Then comes HaOmer and he says, no, just count days. What do you mean it's not in his parsha? He's got to tell me, why did he drop the ball on counting weeks? So the Sfas Emes says because it's Zeichel and Mikdash. And Zeichel and Mikdash is the element in Parshas Emor of counting days. But what about counting weeks? Emor says count weeks as well. And not only that, Parshas Re'eh requires you to count weeks because of Chag HaShavuos. That should be d'oraisa b'zman hazeh. I don't get it. HaOmer is saying that today all we have is Zeichel and Mikdash. And he disagrees with Rav Ashi and Abaye, who counted weeks. He didn't count weeks. Why didn't HaOmer count weeks? I don't get it. As far as there's something missing here. I mean, it's probably
again,
missing up here, but
you can't say that when HaOmer is saying you have to count weeks. We're not talking about the mitzvah
that's not
of
so,
counting
Joe,
weeks.
because HaOmer was commenting and disagreeing with Abaye
Right.
and Rav Ashi. That's the whole
Right.
story.
He's
The Gemara is
saying,
telling us that Rav Ashi insisted on counting weeks and not only days. Came along HaOmer, he says, drop it. I'm not going to count weeks. I'm going to just count
he
days.
didn't say that. Does it say he don't count
That's
weeks?
what it says. Yeah.
It doesn't say don't count weeks.
That's what
It
he
just
says.
says-
That's his whole. That's the whole machlokas here between HaOmer and the other Amoraim. Right? Take a look. On the bottom
he
of
says,
page
just
209.
count
Again,
days.
if we had more time, I would take out the Gemara Menachos and show you inside. But it says over there that HaOmer lo hayamona shvuos. Do you see that? Lo hayamona shvuos. Aliyamim bilvad. That's where he disagreed with. Otherwise, there's no machlokas. If you're telling me that even HaOmer counted weeks, then there's absolutely no machlokas between Rav Ashi and Abaye on one end and HaOmer on the other. Rav Ashi and Abaye counted both weeks and days. All right, I can't do better than that. That's all I can do. All right.
Can it be that when you make it Zecher LeMikdash, you don't want it to be totally like the Mikdash? So you make a difference and you say, I'm only counting. You don't want.
Then it's
Bobby, you're breaking up,
like the
Bobby.
Beis HaMikdash.
Yeah. Well, let's not get broken up about this. But what I wanted to say is that I wouldn't say that in Zeichel HaMikdash, I dafka have to make a shinui from the Mikdash. You know, what am I afraid that somebody might accuse me of recreating a mitzvah that doesn't exist? I wouldn't say that. But furthermore, if the mitzvah of counting weeks is written in both Parshas Re'eh and in Parshas Emor, I wouldn't drop the ball on counting weeks. Not only that, but he says, and Sfas Emes says that the reason why the Torah commanded us to count weeks is to guarantee that at the culmination of 7 weeks, we observe Chag HaShavuos. I think I mentioned to you last time, if you remember, which was, I think, a week ago or so, that the Goyim call it Pentecost. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just move on. We don't have that much time. But I think there's something important here. What is the essence and the goal of Sefirat? Now, if you're going to argue that Sefirat Bizman Hazeh is Doraisa, then you're basically cutting the apron string, apron cord, whatever it's called, on the connection to the karbanos, because today we don't have the karbanos, but we still have Sefirat HaOmer, and that's the sheet of the Rambam. Sefirat HaOmer is Doraisa. So what are we counting? If you're not counting from the Omer to the Shtei Lechem, so what's the purpose and the goal of counting? So if you take a look in footnote number 14, he quotes the Ran. And many of the Rishonim and the Achronim echo this sheet of the Ran, that the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer is basically Simchas Torah. Not the original Simchas Torah as we call it, but the Simcha of Matan Torah. We are counting like a Chas and Kala, they're counting down the days until the wedding. And we left Mitzrayim, and now we're counting down the days until we get to our Sinai and receive the Torah. But here on page 213, he says that we have a classic nafkamina between Doraisas and Derabbanans in a case where a man starts a meal and all of a sudden, boom, he hits himself on the head and he says, I forgot to do a mitzvah. So take, for example, the mitzvah of lulav. If lulav is Bizman Hazeh Doraisa, l'kachtem lachem, at least on the first day, then if I remind myself midway through a Su'udah that I forgot to take the lulav, I have to stop my Su'udah. I cannot continue, and I have to shake the lulav. What do I do if in the middle of a Su'udah I have a mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer, which I forgot to implement before I started the Sefirah? And based on the Mishnah Brura and other Achronim, he says it all depends. If Sefirah Bismana says the Rabbanan, then the law is that if you remind yourself of a mitzvah Rabbanan midway through the Suda, you're allowed to finish the Suda and then fulfill the mitzvah. But if you hold like the Rambam Shita, that Sefirah HaOmer Bismana says Doraisa, boom, the very moment that you remind yourself that, oy vey, I didn't count the Omer, you got to stop the middle of your Suda and count the Omer. And now we get to the most fascinating part of our discussion, which is on the bottom of page 213. Are women obligated in the mitzvah of Sefirat HaOmer? You should give me a clap on the head for even asking that question. What's the answer to that question?
No.
No, I mean, it's classic mitzvah Hazeh Shazman Groma. You fulfill the mitzvah from the 16th of Nisan until Erev Shavuos. Lo tehei mitzvahs Hazeh shazman groma gedol ha-Sefirat HaOmer. The entire mitzvah is framed and generated by a time period, by dates in the calendar. That's man groma, is it not? And there's an amazing Ramban. The Ramban, you'll see it in footnote number 19, has an enumerated list of mitzvahs Hazeh shenoshim chayovas ben she'ein hazman groma. A whole list. And on that list, he has Sefirat HaOmer. Sefirat HaOmer, says the Ramban, is not Zman Groma. And everyone and their uncle tries to rack their brains and figure out why the Ramban classifies Sefirat HaOmer as a mitzvah secha ein Zman Groma. And of course, you have, I think it's the Divrei Malkiel. If I had a minute, I'll look up who the Divrei Malkiel is in my Beis Haketz Forum. And you'll see that in the Divrei Malkiel, here in footnote number 20, this is always a good answer to any question. He says it's a Torah Sofer. What happened was the Sofer was copying over Rashi Tevos, and he saw Rashi Tevos that looked like Sefirat HaOmer. It said Samach Hey Ayin Sefirat HaOmer, and that's how he copied it. But says the Divrei Malkiel, Samach Hey Ayin does not refer to Sefirat HaOmer, but rather to Seder HaAvoda, which is clearly an entire Seder that takes you from the beginning of the day to the end. Alternatively, he says that what was written in the Ramban's manuscript, we don't have access to it, was Mem Tov Ayin, which means Matnas Aniyim. Matnas Aniyim is not Zman Groma. It's not time-bound. Whenever the Ani needs money, I give him money. But the Madik, who copied the manuscript of the Ramban, he thought that Mem Tov Ayin is a reference to Sefirat HaOmer. I'm not exactly sure how that works out. Mem Tov Ayin. The Ayin is Omer. The Mem maybe is mitzvah. I don't know where you fit the tough in. I couldn't figure out. So that's always a good way out. You know, if you have no way out, you say it was a mistake in the copy. But all the other Achronim claim that if you had the manuscript of the Ramban, it would say Sefirat HaOmer there as a mitzvah seisha ein hazman groma. And the Hegyonei Halacha here presents two approaches to try to justify the Ramban as we have the Ramban. One is from Rav Fischel Perlau, who is very famous for his super commentary, which I have here. I don't have the original, but on the Sefirat Mitzvahs of Rav Saadia Gaon. He says that we could talk about Zman Groma in two different ways. There's a Zman Groma in which the Zman is Gorem, and there's a Zman Groma in which the Zman is a result of Davar Acher, of something external to the mitzvah. It's sort of like, in my mind, I don't know if this will help anybody, it's like playing billiards. You know, when you play billiards, you know, you hit one ball that hits another ball and finally hits the third ball. So he's saying that Zman Groma means that the Zman hits the ball, but you can have something else where the mitzvah itself could exist independent of that Zman, but it hits off on something else, and that Dover Acher is what's Gorem, that projects the mitzvah, and that Dover Acher limits the mitzvah to a time period. I'm just curious. Again, there are a few people here who don't show their face, so I'm just going to address myself to the three people who do show their face. Oh, now we're down to two. Did you understand what I just said? Oh, Joe just dropped out too. Bruce, okay, we have one person, Baruch Hashem, who understood. Oh, there's David. Are you telling me you understood, David? So. He says the following. You can count these 49 days anytime during the year. The only trouble is that it's the HaOmer that's brought on the 16th of Nisan that triggers off the Sefirat. But the Sefirat per se is not totally in Zman, but it's totally in Davar Acher, which is namely the HaOmer. And the HaOmer depends upon Zman. That's not called a Zman Grom. So once the Torah says that Sefirat HaOmer depends upon the HaOmer or the time of the HaOmer, then you could only count the HaOmer during these days. But in and of themselves, inherently, the Sefirat could apply the whole year round. Masha Enkein, let's say Lulav, or Sukkah, or Matzah, there the Zman is Gorem the mitzvah. As Rashi says in Kedushin, Hazman Gorem la mitzvah lama. It would be ridiculous to sit in Sukkah in July in Toronto, you know, when the sun comes out, because that's not a mitzvah of Sukkah. The mitzvah of Sukkah is time-bound. It's generated by time. But it would be meaningful to count the days of Sefirat anytime during the year, if not for the fact that the Torah made it dependent on the HaOmer. And the HaOmer depends upon a certain date. So the HaOmer is a mitzvah seishas ma'in groma, but not the Sefirat HaOmer. Very abstract. Then he goes on to quote Reb Shlomo Kluger. And that's on the bottom of 214 going on to 215. I just want to say one thing before we go on to Reb Shlomo Kluger. The Marshal, who lived 5 centuries ago, is famous for saying that women are obligated in what we call Kiddush Levana. Why? Isn't that a typical classic case of Zman Groma? The halacha is you can only recite the bracha only when the what's it called, the moon is waxing, right? The first half of the month. So it's a time-bound mitzvah. But according to Rav Fischel, perhaps we could say it's not a time-bound mitzvah. I can thank Hashem for the Levana anytime. The only thing is, it's dependent upon the Levana B'chidusha. So the Levana B'chidusha is man grama, but not the bracha that we recite for the Levana B'chidusha. And now we get to Rav Shlomo Kluger. Rav Shlomo Kluger claims, and you'll see this on the top line of 215, that what does man grama mean? It means hazman tavua beguf ha-mitzvah. Those are the four key words. If we could only figure out and decipher the meaning of those four words. Hazman tavua beguf ha-mitzvah. He says that every mitzvah has an entity. I guess you'd call it a chefta. So take, for example, the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah. You need a sukkah. The mitzvah of the tilas lulav. You need a lulav. In the mitzvah of matzah, you need matzah. If the Torah says that that entity, sukkah, lulav, or matzah, is only gains its status at a certain period of time, that means that hazman tavua beguf ha-mitzvah. The guf ha-mitzvah is the sukkah, the lulav, and the matzah. And when is it called sukkah? When is it called lulav? When is it called matzah? That's the zman tavua beguf ha-mitzvah. The guf ha-mitzvah is the sukkah, and there's no sukkah the rest of the year. Sefirat HaOmer is the guf ha-mitzvah is to count the days. And he writes that kan hazman mishamesh. Just 1 second. I thought I understood this, but now I'm going over it. Let me just give me a minute here. I know I don't have much more than a minute, but. Oh, no. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's etch a sketch. Let's start from the beginning. He's saying like this. You can have a sukkah, a physical sukkah, the whole year round. You can have a lulav the whole year round. You can have matzah the whole year round. But the Torah commands me to eat the matzah in that 7-day period. That's called the Zman Grama, where the option existed in the Welt to fulfill the mitzvah at any time, because you have matzah the whole year round, and the Torah limits it to that week. But let's say, for example, like, I'll give you an example, Mikra Bikurim. Mikra Bikurim depends upon when that particular species or grain exists out in the field. And the Gemara says that by Hanukkah time, it's so cold, I guess, that you won't find it. It's kol l'chayim in asad. You won't find it there. And therefore, there's no mitzvah mikra bikurim. In that case, you have a mitzvah seisha ein hazman grama. Why? Because the mitzvah could not possibly be at any other time of the year, by the very nature of the mitzvah. Because it's already kol l'chayim in asad after Hanukkah. So the Torah did not go out of its way in mikra bikurim to say, yeah, you could have theoretically had this mitzvah all year round, I'm going to be mitzamtzem, I'm going to withdraw and restrict the mitzvah for a certain period of time. And therefore, it's not similar to our paradigm in cases of sukkah, lulav, matzah, where the theoretical mitzvah could have existed any time during the year because the chefts exist the whole time. So when the mitzvah, by its very essence, is time bound, then paradoxically it's not a zman groma. Because to be zman groma, it has to be a mitzvah that could theoretically apply the whole year round. So when he says on the top line of 215, hazman tavua begufa mitzvah, that means it's a mitzvah, say, she'eina zman groma. That's why I got messed up a little before. I forgot that zman, I thought that zman tavua begufa mitzvah makes it into zman groma. No. It's mafkia, it makes it into an eina zman groma, because the zman is tavua begufa mitzvah. So, for example, if I were to ask you about Kiddush Levana, and we mentioned earlier the Marshal, that women are obligated, the answer is because that's a case where the Zman is Tavua Begufa Mitzvah. The mitzvah is to be Mavarech, the Levana Bechidusha. And that can only be during certain days of the year, of the month, I mean. So at the end of this long presentation, he talks about Mikra Bikurim, and that's on page 215. He writes, Mitzvahs Havas Bikurim, he mitzvah seishas man groma, shekein ein mevim Bikurim elam me'atzeres v'yad Chanuk. And yet, Nashim Chayovos be'Havas Bikurim. I mentioned Mikra Bikurim, but he talks about Havas Bikurim, right? We'd have to learn more about Bikurim. But he says the following. Masha ein mevim Bikurim achar Chanukah. That's not because the Torah limited the Zman of the mitzvah. El mishum shechanukah b'tkufas hachorefu. It's in the winter months. V'ein Bikurim b'sadeh. But ilu haya od mitzuyim b'sadeh hayu ayamim yimei avas bikurim. In a sense, Rav Shlomo Kluger is the exact opposite of Rav Yerucham Perlau. Do you follow me? Because Rav Yerucham Perlau is saying that if it's totally b'dover acher, then it's not a mitzvah saying it's just mind grom. Whereas Rav Shlomo Kluger is saying that if the essence of the mitzvah depends upon a time period, then it's not a mitzvah seishas man groma. Rabbi Yerucham Perlau would say that's goofy a definition of man groma. It's man groma because the essence of the mitzvah is limited in time. But if the mitzvah depends on something else that's external to the mitzvah, like the HaOmer in the case of Sefirat, then it's lav's man groma. And finally, in the last paragraph, we're a little bit over time, he says something hashkafit. And he says that according to the Ran, as we mentioned before, that elucidated the Rama of Chita, Sefirat HaOmer V'zman said Doraisa, the Sefirat is culminates in Kabbalah Satorah, in Chag HaShavuos. And he says the following, that with Yetzias Mitzrayim, when the Ol HaShibud was removed, what replaces the Shibud? Cherus. What is Cherus? Cherus, in its ideal complete form, is Kabbalah Satorah. Ein lecha ben chorin el mi shosek b'Torah. So in essence, Yetzias Mitzrayim does not culminate with Cherus because we haven't yet received the Torah. Our Shibud is still dormant, as it were, but it still exists. So therefore, Yetzias Mitzrayim is a preparatory stage for Cherus, But ultimately, Cheres is achieved at the end of a period of time when we receive the Torah at Har Sinai. So this entire period of time connecting Yetzias Mitzrayim to Matan Torah is one long hechsher, one long preparation for the ultimate goal of Cheres, which is Matan Torah. And on the top of page 216, Al Tikri Cheres Ela Cherus. It's got to be Charas Ala Luchos, and these were the Luchos that were given to us at Har Sinai. They represent ultimate Cherus. So the Torah now becomes the Ikar. Yetzias Mitzrayim is only Tafel. It's meant to lead up to the culmination of Kabbalas HaTorah. In that sense, we understand very well why Sefirat HaOmer Bizman Hazeh, according to the Rambam, is Doraisa, because the Ikar is the Simchas HaTorah, the Tikkun of completely undermining the Shibud of Mitzrayim when we get to the level of Cheres at the time of Matan Torah. Now, I was thinking for next week we would talk about Pesach Sheni. The only problem is that I think Pesach Sheni is coming around the bend here. Let me just, when is Pesach Sheni? Today is what? Today is
25.
Pesach Sheni is on
today
Sunday,
is the 10th.
Yom Rishon.
Am I right that today is the 10th of Iyar?
Yes, it's on Sunday, Yom Rishon.
Yeah. So Pesach Sheni, the 14th of Iyar, is Yom Rishon, correct?
But next week is Lag BaOmer on Thursday.
So you know what? Maybe Wednesday of next week, a week from today, we'll try to see if we could, I don't have anything now, but maybe we'll find the bridge between Pesach Sheni, which is just 4 days earlier, and Lag BaOmer, which is the next day. Does that sound right? B'li neder. I don't know if I'll find such a thing, but all right then.
Okay, thank you, Rav.
Thank you so much. Kol Tuv.
Hold on.
Too.
All of this.